All right, thank you, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I am Melissa Ralstead. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. We are very excited today to be joined by Kathy Weaver. The museum is located just north of Milwaukee in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, so we are extremely excited. You can check out more information about the museum, plan a visit. We are open with safety protocols in place. You can check out more information at www.wiquiltmuseum.com. We'll also post that in the chat. A few things today. If you do have questions, we're going to hold questions to the end, but you are more than welcome to ask them in the chat as we go along. We will be monitoring the chat. We will also be monitoring questions on Facebook. And so we will have a chance. I will ask Kathy your questions at the end, but feel free to post them as we go. And then we also owe a debt of gratitude to Kathy and to Judy Hurst, one of our board members who helped to make today possible. We also would like to thank the Wisconsin Arts Board and the National Endowment for the Arts for grant funding to help support this, as well as the Kohler Foundation to help support these programs. With COVID, it has been a challenge. We're happy to be able to offer these, but your donations also help. And we'll be posting ways that you can donate to the museum to help keep programs like this going in the chat. So if you would like to make a donation, we'd greatly appreciate it. And like I said, I am extremely happy to be joined by Kathy Weaver today. Weaver has exhibited both nationally and internationally, including at the International Triennial in Poland, Art Market in Stockholm, Platforms Art Fair in Athens, the Dubuque Museum, Rockford Museum, Visions Art Museum in San Diego, our friends, the Ukrainian Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Museum of Art and Design, New York City. Solo shows include the Art Center of Highland Park in Illinois, Visions Art Museum, Woman Made Gallery, Chicago State University, Gordon Center for Integrative Art, the University of Chicago, Concordia College, Olympia Center, and Goshen College in Indiana. Honors include an Illinois Arts Grant, National Endowment for the Arts Studio Grant, a Quilt National Emerging Artist Award, a Jurors Award at the Evanston and Vicinity Show, Dubuque Museum Acquisition Award, Rockford Museum Jurors Award, a Mayor Award for the Arts from Highland Park, Illinois. Weaver has also worked as an educator in the public schools and received an MA from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. So we are extremely happy and excited to have you join us. Thank you so much, Kathy. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the Wisconsin Museum of Art and Fiber Arts, of Quilts and Fiber Arts, Judy Hurst, for making the connection. Melissa, you guys are so organized. It's an honor, really, to be here. I appreciate it. So to all of you out there, I'd love it if this were in real life, but we have to look at the I guess the silver lining of the COVID cloud is that we can be in our places and see things far away and learn stuff. So with that, let's get started. And we'll switch to my images. Okay. Go to the beginning, and here we are. This is my website, so if you're interested in being in contact or having my newsletter, you can look at it through here and get connected. I do want to give a little context to where we're going here. I was telling Melissa that it's a pleasure really to get a presentation like this together, because you look back through your old things and you see where you've come from, and maybe that leads to some way forward too. So I was looking through some old files, and I found this file from my mother's house, and in it was a drawing I had never seen before. I didn't remember, and on it it said I was 6 years old. And the reason I'm putting it in here, it was just amazing to me, because that very same week I had finished this small medallion. I'm doing a series of these with gouache, And I was struck by the likenesses 70 plus years down the road. It really made me think. And I had saved a quote from the New York Review of Books by a person named Hilton Alls, who's a writer and a critic. And I think it just sums up and is the groundwork for not only this lecture, but for my work. And he says, we're all from somewhere. It's the artist's job to question the value that went into the making of that somewhere. And he goes on to say, question the status quo has been his life and artistic mission. And I really feel that way. I was and am an artist. This was a photograph used for advertising by a commercial photographer, and the perk was that I got a brand new easel out of it. I've been a teacher, an art teacher for 34 years, and this is a picture of me as a young teacher. And if any of you are teachers out there, you know that the school pictures allow us every year a record of our aging. And I am a wife and a mother, and here is a picture of us, the family unit, backpacking, one of our favorite activities. And I was and continue to be an activist for human rights in different forms. Well, this constant struggling, and I know many of you women out there, especially those who work full-time, we all juggled so many hats, and it was very stressful. This quilt, The Crazed Lady, was really seminal in that it was a point I was very stressed, but I realized that I could, instead of taking subject matter from newspapers and my readings, I could take it from my personal life. And I have to say that whoever I am now is really due to a lot of that struggle and stress from that period. I also want to say, if you ever see that quilt, it was stolen, so it is mine. Anyway, I wouldn't be where I am now also without these two people. I was very lucky in growing up to have, as a mother and a grandmother, these incredible needle workers. I mean, my grandmother and her sisters were never without something in their lap, whether it was needlepoint or quilting. And my mother was just incorrigible. I'd come home from school, I'd never know which project she was embarking on, and it was all just really fantastic. I grew up in the beautiful Susquehanna River Valley in eastern Pennsylvania, very near the Amish country. And my grandfather was a dentist, and he would take us with him when he went on house calls. And we were surrounded by a lot of folk art. For example, these hex signs. And in my parents' house was hanging this real example of Pennsylvania folk art, a fracture. I think it was a baptismal certificate. It was from my great-grandfather. The other side, the flip side of my growing up, was my father, who looked toward the future. He was in electronics, and some of my favorite memories are playing in the factory, surrounded by all this machinery and wires and everything. They made transformers. And I think my interest in space and the future certainly comes from him. I grew up in the era when the moonwalk was happening, and there was really great possibilities for the future. We really looked forward. And my sister and I, our favorite pastime was devouring comics. We just had stacks of them. And I loved, my favorite was Wonder Woman. And I always thought the W on her invisible plane was for Weaver, but my sister told me it wasn't. Well, many of my influences came from, I was lucky enough to spend a year in Vienna in college. This is not Vienna. This is a friend and I on a side trip, a youth hostel trip to Egypt. But I was very lucky to have as influences their terrific art collection at their major art museum in Vienna of Cranach the Elder. He was a Northern Renaissance painter, and I just loved the style and the colors and the format of his paintings. And here's one now. You may not see the influences, but I do. The long, narrow format and the rhythmic patterning. I'm going to run through some influences pretty quickly. Goya for his painting technique, and of course for his presentation of war as a total disaster. Otto Dix, who was in First World War trench warfare and came out doing amazing drawings and prints of it. My grandmother had hanging in her kitchen several Grandma Moses pictures, which I just adored. They were of an area like ours in Pennsylvania, and the narration and the pattern and the animation were just, I think, embedded in my brain. And you couldn't grow up, I moved to Chicago after college, and you couldn't grow up as a young adult in Chicago and not be influenced by the Harry Who, or they were sometimes called the Chicago Imagists, and their colorful patterns and their use of art material from pop art and from comic books and advertising was really influential. But the most important overriding heroine for me was certainly Katie Kollwitz. We share a birthday. She lost a son and a grandson in World War I and II, respectively, and dedicated her life to prints and drawings about protest of war and of the conditions of poor people. Well, my husband and I got to travel. We quit our jobs and went on a shoestring budget around the world for a year. And I had a lot of exposure at that time to pattern in fabric and in architecture and in folk art. And when we came back, I did this piece about Hiroshima that we had visited in Japan. And it's full of photographs and all sorts of different techniques. When I first met Nelson, I told him that one of the requirements of a relationship was time in Japan and the East, because from a design point of view, I was determined to try and understand a non-Western aesthetic. So this is a quilt that I made about Soweto, and I'll explain that in a minute, but I do want to have a quote here from Warren Seelig, who you may be familiar with. In a recent article in the Surface Design Journal, he wrote, "The fiber medium, contrary to being on the fringe in craft-related niche, has invaded the art world." He writes, "A single thread can morph into volumes. The energy utilized in the repetitious act, whether it's looping, knitting, and I add quilting or embroidery, is captured as visual energy within the surface and experienced viscerally by the viewer." And I just think that's so true. And inherent in cloth are all the qualities that are humane. It's like a second skin to us. It's recyclable, it's transportable, it's sustainable. And especially now in this era when we're so tied to the computer screen and virtuality, I think people really, really do crave the handmade. So back to this piece, Soweto Suite. I did several of these. It was about apartheid in South Africa. And this one happens to be about the treatment of the workers in the De Beers mines in South Africa. And you can see there's photographs, there's painting, many different materials. I like to use different materials in my quilts. Well, this piece is from a Coors beer ad, and normally the GI would be holding a can of beer, but here he's showing an article that shows the disparity in the amount of money we spent on the stealth airplane compared to what we were spending on education. And I do want to say that at this time I was working in the inner city schools in Chicago, and the teachers were buying all the supplies. The rooms were a wreck. It was kind of a bad situation. And I was thinking, you know, now that the Berlin Wall was coming down, wouldn't there be more money available for social services and education? And that's what this quilt was about. So in this neighborhood, there were a lot of gangs, and this particular school that I was working at was in the dividing line between two gangs, and there were a lot of drive-by shootings. And it makes me so sad that these quilts are still relevant today. These were done more than 10 years ago. But it had as subject matter the number of children that died in 1 year in Chicago. And these are DOD, date of death tags, toe tags on skeletons of the children. And above are drawings that I did with the children in the neighborhood about their emotions. I did a series of quilts with children in the neighborhood. It was probably more than a 2-year project. This is a picture of the total quilt. They were called funerary pieces, and this one was about memorials in the cities taken from postcards and things, but why don't we have memorials to the victims of this war in our streets? And this one, the third one, which has a very feminine coloration, was done based on a girl in the neighborhood who had been shot. It took her a long time to recover. And out of it came the series of quilts that I did with neighborhood teenage girls, where each child did a dream quilt, trying to determine where she would be when she was older, what were the aspirations that that child had. It was really a wonderful project. This is a detail, and these 3 quilts are the ones that are in the Museum of Art and Design, and they have traveled widely. Well, I wanted to express more personal feelings, I guess, not so much political and topical taken from newspapers, not to rely so much on data, but more on my own emotions. And some of the previous topics were really depressing, and so I took this break. I'd been doing robot quilts with the kids in my classes and making, oh my God, we made robot sculptures and drawings. We made quilts for Ronald McDonald House with robots all over them. So I thought I'd try my hand at some robot quilts for fun. And of course, they turned from playful ones to talking about the environment. So the Cyborg female series examines kind of in a whimsical manner our relationship to the earth, and each one gives a gift to the earth. And in this instance, the robots are decidedly female, as opposed to how we always think of robots as the Terminator destructor type. And they're larger than life. They're each about 7.5 feet tall. And like I said, they offer a gift to nature in their hands. And they also take the S-curve stance of the Renaissance figures. You can think of Botticelli's Venus coming from the sea. And I thought it was a funny dichotomy that they also kind of mimicked runway models. So here you can see it's a whole cloth quilt with borders of different kinds of tapestries and, you know, appliqued ferns on them, painted images as well. They're airbrushed, so they were consisting of hundreds of little pieces of paper that I ironed on and then took off one by one as I airbrushed each color. Well, on to the Robo Sapiens, Agents 1 through 6. This is kind of my rogues gallery of portraits. This particular one was the one that won the Kathy Rasmussen Emerging Artist Award at Quilt National. So I'm really excited. It's now in the collection of the International Museum of Quilts in Nebraska. So using just the low-tech materials of needle, thread, and airbrush, I tried to question technological progress and militarism. So the agents in these particular quilts have echoes of Abu Ghraib, suspension of habeas corpus, and the general mindlessness and destruction of war. So I liked the airbrush as a tool because you can see the machine-like rendering that it gets. The artist's hand is not visible. And it reminds us of kind of the atomic advertising age when science was worshipped and progress was the future. And I used naugahyde for these because it has kind of a human skin-like surface. And my great old Bernita just chunked right through all that pleather. So the stitchery and the beads are reminiscent of intimacy and the nurturing quality of quilts. Well, choosing robots as subject matter for the portraits has certainly been influenced by Cynthia Brazil's work at the MIT Media Lab, where her Kismet robot, which you've probably seen pictures of, has exaggerated humanoid features, and it also has a voice, and it converses and interacts with people. And it's very uncanny, and it brings into the question, how tolerant will we be toward non-human helpmates? And a while ago, I was able to, through the exhibiting of the cyborg females, I was able to be part of a conference of scientists from all over the world coming to Indiana University at Bloomington, talking about, giving papers and talking about the state of the artificial intelligence field. And out of this conference and other readings came a new aspect of my work. I really became interested in robotics themselves, not so much as a symbol. And one aspect of this was my work at the Rehab Institute in Chicago, which is now called the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And believe me, it's a place you do not want to be. It is a hospital and a research facility dealing with victims of traumatic injury. And I approached the robotics department there and asked if I could draw some of the robots that they are developing to help victims. And like all of us, I was really disturbed by the toll that the war was taking on the young soldiers coming back without limbs from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And the heads of the department were just fantastic. I thought they'd say no, and they were so welcoming. And I spent probably more than 2 years going there once a week drawing. And I was able eventually to draw patients using these prototype robots that are shipped all over the world to hospitals. This is a quilt that came out of that from the biomechatronics lab. It was just a tablescape. I would draw things that I just saw in front of me. And I blew this up large, I think with spoon feather, and airbrushed the colors in, and then, you know, embroidered a lot of the wires and things are hand embroidered. So on to another group where the robot acts as a spokesperson. I use the robot form in my work to act as a kind of Cassandra or an observer and a teller of tales. And in this quilt, much maligned Pandora is a stand-in for those of us who do not want the earth and its people ravaged by the chaos and destruction of war. So silkscreened all around here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's hundreds of words from the military, from a site I found that describes terrorism, counterintelligence, and various kinds of weaponry. And on the bottom is egg temperate panel, and then beneath that is some velvet with some metal studs, and then there's hand embroidery and applique. So I use all sorts of material. And people often ask me, why the robot? You know, why are you using this? And I would say that the armor-clad robot often allows me to say things of a personal nature, and it kind of acts as a bridge between the viewer and me. Here we have Fire Slinger. And Fire Slinger, the quilt, is attempting to control or mine the environment. This series was called Cri de Coeur, which means an appeal or a cry from the heart. This particular quilt was taken from Fukushima, a photograph that I saw of the workers on stilts going into this radiated water. You remember that after the tsunami. Invader brought forth, for me, it meant fear of terrorists and terrorism in our cities, and also fear of ingrown civil war. And this is a detail. You can see the hand embroidery and the quilting up close. Again, another whole cloth quilt done with the airbrush. Destroying Angel, I think Melissa mentioned the fiber art triennial in Łódź, Poland. We pronounce it Lutz, it's L-O-D-Z, but they pronounce it Łódź. And I was really honored to be one of 4 artists representing the US in that particular triennial. And we did get to go, and it was just amazing, the refurbished textile old weaving mills. They just did a fantastic job making exhibition halls and shopping malls and hotels out of these Victorian brick buildings, which had been the center of tapestry and weaving for centuries. So James Ude, the late Chicago artist critic, has said that textile artists have rehabituated materials overlooked by patriarchal views of what constituted significant art materials. Well, I'm definitely in the camp of the rehabituators because I'm intentionally doing this by using the quilt form for political statements and by depicting robots with soft, nurturing fabrics. And as you look at the following several quilts, keep in mind that these are an illustration of how I use robots as broad metaphors for universal and political themes. So here we have the gilt birds on her shoulders, they're hand embroidered, and above you can see heavy ornamentation with buttons and other things. This was my take on demagoguery, and I do want to say about these quilts, I have several in this series, and these are really my favorite. I did these, I was sick for almost a month with pneumonia. I was off work and I couldn't get to silk screening and airbrushing, and I had needle, thread, and fabric scraps. And it was so wonderful to realize that you could create something just with those materials. The robot says nothing. This is the robotic cycle. That was the robot says nothing. And some of my quilts are very personal. They show cycles of despair and hope. We all have our ups and downs. I love using found objects and fabric with nostalgic references. And here you can see fishing worms on the right-hand side and rabbit's feet and some appliqued commercial roses. Well, I also work in 3 dimensions. I use paper mache, sometimes clay, mannequins, and plush toys. And this is a sculpture that I made, which was on wheels. And then I thought it was going to be a prototype for a future parade of characters that would be crudely roboticized. Here's a doll that I took and reconstructed. It has a beautiful painted box, and when it lays down in the box, its eyes close. This is one that I used, one of those greeting cards that when you open it up, it sings to you. And the song was What I Like About You. And what I added, what I like about you is your curiosity. And when you opened it, there was some kind of a cheesy scene inside. This has inside Shakey's head is a Mattel child's toy that when you push your fingers into Shakey's eyeballs, he giggles and moves and shakes. I sometimes went to CVS and Walgreens after Easter and Halloween and got their little animatronic toys, and then would strip them and make more of them, or make other, I guess you'd alter them. This one was a witch. You can see her flashing red eyes, and she screeches as she, and now he goes around with his gun. These series are based on mannequins. I have to tell you a funny story because I was on an errand and I saw this store that was going out of business and everything must go, and it was full of mannequins. And so I raced back, I got my neighbor's van, and I went back up and loaded up with mannequins. And needless to say, my husband is the doll. We still have some mannequins that need to be finished. But it does have a hole in its head where if you go close, there's a monitor inside there and a motion sensor, and it will speak to you. And also the backs of the heads open up because we all have images in our own heads. Well, on a different vein, thinking and reading more about robotics as opposed to just depicting robots led in time to more study about the field of artificial intelligence. And I learned a lot about biology and language and robotic engineering and genetics and about nanotechnology. And I became interested in the idea of miniaturization. What would happen if we could really be, and I think this certainly will happen, tiny enough, have machines tiny enough, robots tiny enough to go through our bodies and help us with various circulatory systems or whatever. So this is an example of my depiction of that. So here I was using the forms, textures, and colors that kind of reminded me of maybe the biological mix from which life developed, the primordial soup, these kind of forms. So here you can see the way that the airbrush can give a lot of layering and texturing. Well, the idea of sentient beings and all of this was very interesting to me, fascinating. And I began to think about the interiors of different organisms. They really explore more of my interpretation of nanotechnology. Imagine if we would be able to view the interior and the neural pathways and the dendrites up close. Or if we were miniaturized enough, and I think that's happening, to go into outer space or go down into the deep trench and see the beautiful organisms and life forms that are there. This is the reverse, as was the one you saw previously. This is black satin, bridal satin. Well, not bridal satin, I guess, if it's black, but black satin with white airbrush. And you can see how you can modulate the forms. And then I would enhance it with embroidery and applique. This is another, and I did this during the time of the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon spill. I guess it's not surprising that this came to mind, but I will say that I work very subconsciously. I try to bring up forms that are in my mind. I might have resources, pictures and things around my studio, but when I start, I don't have a sketch. I just start by painting on the satin with the airbrush. And then as the form develops, I might make more of it. Like my daughter came into the studio and said, "Oh, Mom, you're making something about the oil spill." And I hadn't really thought about that. And then I realized, yes, I was. And so I made more by making these little dastardly oil plumes coming up. This is Cooperative Navigation, again, talking about miniaturization, being able to go into space or into the interior. And this generated topologist just came back from a 2-year tour, including Japan and Europe. Thank you, SACWA, Studio Art Quilt Association. And here I was really interested in the workings of the brain and the dendrites and the synapses, and trying to put it all together into some kind of phantasmagoric environment. Well, I do smaller fiber works too. These are scraps of fabric that I've collaged together. And then once I see that a form is happening through the airbrushing and further embroidery, I enhance it to make the theme come forward. Here you can see on the bottom is a painted panel, and then there's a lot of hand embroidery. On the lower right, you can see hand embroidery and stitching as well. And that brings us to some more recent work. I was really doing a lot of drawing, and I was kind of frustrated sometimes by not being able to express with the drawn line on fabric as much as I wanted to. So I found, actually it was a purveyor in Wisconsin that was selling large rolls of shoji paper. And shoji paper is used for the Japanese screens that people used to have in their houses. And it's very tough. This is machine quilted, it's airbrushed, it's painted, it's drawn. And this will be in a show in Minneapolis this, actually at the end of this month called Racism, the Hate We Resist. And it's organized by the formidable Carolyn Maslumi. It was covered in the New York Times, and about half the exhibit, and I don't know if mine will be part of that, will travel to the Smithsonian and to other venues. And I will say about Carolyn, she has probably been very responsible for African-American quilts coming to the fore and showing their true glory. Well, I was so appalled by the abduction of the 276 girls from their school in Chibok, Nigeria, in the middle of the night by the Boko Haram, which means Western education is forbidden, that I did this piece called Abduction. We still don't know where many of the girls are, whether they're alive or not. And in the beginning of March, there were more raids and hundreds of children were taken. They were returned, but it's an ongoing horrible situation that comes out of local wars. So this is a transition to paper more. You can see the stitching. This is Reeves drawing paper and it's quite heavy, so I puncture all the holes before I sew them. I airbrush, draw, paint, and this series was called, this series was Collateral Damage, and talked about, in this particular one, the numbers of people that are on the road around the world because of economic devastation or local wars, just massive numbers of people, more ever than ever in history, trying to find a place in the world. This one, Fireside Chat at the DMZ being the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. I don't know if this was inspired by Dennis Rodman's visit or by just the fact that Kim Jong-un is such an unstable dictator who has in his hands nuclear capabilities. So on these pedestals are the interiors of H-bombs, and wouldn't it be nice if people could just sit around a campfire and resolve some of these horrible issues? And you can see the influence of fiber in the patterns of the camo and just in the tremendous array of color and design. And the reason for the turtles is because the soldiers who we still have stationed are from, I think their camp is called Turtle Bay. But I might also add the DMZ is an incredible zone for wildlife. Yeah, it's an amazing place. So here's a detail. This is acrylic on paper, stitched, burned, torn. Well, recently I've been thinking more about what makes people tick, and I don't mean through physical avenues of artificial intelligence or studies of genetics and biology, but more really the inner workings of people's minds and behaviors. So as I get older, I think more deeply in reading about the nature of evil and wrongdoing. What is it in human behavior that allows for such disparity in income and distribution? So I decided to examine some morality tales. I went back to Aesop's fables, which I knew as a child. They came from the 600 AD. And I took some of the lesser known tales and tried to put them into my own quirky modern day settings. These were on wood panels with acrylics, and they were kind of wraparound paintings in that they went around the sides of these thick panels. Here's another. Many of them are related to political situations going on today. And then after doing Aesop's fables, I thought, well, why don't I try to create my own saga, the kind of tale that I wanted to tell about the boundaries between good and evil and what are they and what can we do about this? So I called that series, and there's probably 30 paintings to date and some embroidered maps and some paper mache objects in that series, and I called it The Origin Story. And it has characters, two of which are the winged robot, and here you see the winged robot, and again, the influence of fabrics, doing the flyover. This one is in the Dubuque Museum collection. And here we see the bad guys, the bullet heads swimming with sharks. And here's another example of evil doing. This I did at the time when we were dealing with a separation, or not dealing with a separation of the children from their parents at the border. But my daughter, who's a federal defense lawyer, tells me not everyone is totally evil. Here we have the bullet heads on a family picnic. And that brings us up to the present, pretty much the present. And now with the pandemic, the past year, I've really been focusing on particular characters that I'm calling this series avatars. They're gouache on handmade paper. It's from a factory in Indiana called Twin Rocker. They're 40 by 14. And my intent on this series was to focus attention on particular behaviors that we see around us, especially at this time of racial inequality, cultural upheaval, climate change, pandemic, and the deepening economic divide. So what we have here with the avatars, what I'm trying to do is a crystallization of character in each avatar. I want it to be stripped down to its essence. And these avatars are probably the characters that we set loose in our own imaginations. And they serve as kind of elaborate extensions of ourselves. This one is about ego. She has a basket, she's hiding her talents. I was doing some research, and I came across this sect of Buddhist monks. This was way after I did the painting. And this sect, the Komatsu sect, would put baskets on their head and go around the villages so that they would be egoless. So I thought it was pretty amazing. This one about our youth and the possibilities. I'm very encouraged by the young people that are very intent on changing the status quo. And this, the last image in the series before we do the little studio tour, I think this is my first attempt to try to deal with the scope of the pandemic. So many people have died, and so this is sort of a symbol, crossing the river. So many people have crossed, the river of life. So, not to end on a down note, I do want to show you this video of our studio, and then we'll come back on and answer some questions. So here we have the Cornelia Arts Building.
Hi everybody, welcome to A&W Studios. Armour is Nelson Armour, my husband the photographer, and W is Weaver, for Kathy Weaver. Come on in, welcome, watch your step, and let me take off my jacket, kind of like Mr. Rogers here, and we'll just show you the area first, and then we'll go around and look at some individual works. So this was the stable of this over 100-year-old building. It's perfect space for us. Here on the wall, I put up a lot of things for you to see. This is a whole cloth quilt done with airbrush, of course, and you can see the hand quilting. And one thing about the airbrush that I adore is many textures and layers you can get with the stenciling and configuration of color. This was about the BP oil spill. I propped up down below some smaller pieces. We'll see one in detail more closely. These are collages. I do a number of collages with bits of fabric, embroidery, doing them very intuitively. And here we have a format that I like, probably influenced by my love of Japanese scrolls, a long, tall format. This is black satin this time with white airbrush, and it's my idea of what might be living in the deep trench, the wonderful microorganisms and animals that reside there. And this was because of my love of nanotechnology, I started doing this kind of work. This piece is another example of a collage of the ones that you saw on the floor. I used many different materials. For example, you'll see a painted panel here, and fanciful flowers, and enhanced again with hand embroidery and applique. Okay, well, artists, of course, need need lots of storage. So here's just one example. I've got lots under my work table. We have lots of things we need to use. And I wanted to just very quickly show you the airbrush. I'll turn it on, and you're probably familiar with this, but it's a little trigger action, and it puts out minuscule droplets of paint. And here is the paint. I use Createx airbrush colors. And it's like watercolor in that you build up layers and layers of color to get the effect that you want. And of course, I wouldn't use it without my respirator. And I often open the windows and have a fan going too, so that's really important. We love coming over here. I especially enjoy spending time here. It's kind of my home away from home. So I bring a lot of things with me, lots of memorabilia. I do different kinds of media. Here's an example of a portrait I'm starting of my daughter. Up above is a still life from objects of my studio a while ago in another place. And here we have one of my recent works of the Avatar series. This is 14 by 40 on handmade paper, done with gouache paint. And again, more memorabilia and photographs. There's a shot back in time, me as a young artist, done by a commercial photographer. And so more storage and bookcases. I do a lot of research for the work. I have lots more books upstairs, and of course there's always the internet. In front of you, you see two robots that are, if they were turned on and we were up close, they'd be talking to you because they have sensors and they speak to you. In the corner, we have a glimpse of mannequins that I brought back from a place that was going out of sale. They're ready to be worked on. They've been standing guard there for a little while. Up above is my storage space. Bins of fabric of different colors. And then behind that, racks and racks of quilts, which luckily are pretty portable, can be rolled up and don't weigh a lot. So that's where I'm storing the quilts. This quilt in front of you has just come back from a show that was in many venues in Japan and Europe, Belgium, and then about 4 or 5 places in the United States. So I'm glad to have it back. Again, a whole cloth quilt, very complex, done with airbrush, about nanotechnology and maybe a journey inward with the dendrites and capillaries of our bodies. On the table are some of my favorite quilts, done just with the low-tech needle, thread, and fabric. And it's wonderful to think that you can create things with such simple materials. This one happens to be about demagoguery. I work very intuitively in a Jungian way, and so after I put the figure up there, it suggests certain things to me. And on the back, just for fun, we quilters put things that nobody else sees, just us, just funky fabric. Another example, the robot is guilty, and again, heavily ornamented, and gilt birds on the shoulder, hand embroidered. And here, on the white framed pieces, we have 2 of a series of probably about 30 at this point, where I've decided to make a saga about the boundaries of good and evil using characters that I've developed, one being the winged one and the other the bullet heads. I exhibited these. Here's some examples of Aesop's Fables, kind of a wraparound painting. There's painting on the edges too. These are about tales of morality. I like the idea because they're talking about human behavior, what's right, what's wrong, and to question this universal, especially in these times. This is an example of the use of stitching fabric and paper all together. And there are many I have, many on my website as well, that show the use of how I've incorporated fabric into paper, burning, stitching, tearing, and painting on top of. So I think that kind of concludes the tour of the studio. Very quick, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. I've enjoyed having you, and thank you very much.
Okay, go ahead. I'll second. All right, well, this concludes the presentation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest in my art. And again, if you want to be in contact, contact me. Love to send out my newsletter or whatever. So any questions or anything like that, love to answer.
And Kathy, we actually do have a few questions.
Okay.
So one of them is, your work is very textural. Do you have an idea of the textures before you begin your work?
No, I just have a huge stash. And people give me some very weird material because they know I like oddities. And sometimes I feel like I just want to work with silks and velvets. It just is what the subject matter requires. I think that's how I'd have to say that.
Oh.
And some of my pieces, actually some of the collages, the textures are actually trapuntoed. So they're raised up above the surface on some of, I haven't pictured them here, but.
Well, it's something else. I mean, I love the juxtaposition that you have between the hard and the soft, both in thematically you see that, but also with the textures that you're bringing then. So, I mean, it seems like you're, you know, even if you don't have it in mind, they end up working that way with what you're creating.
Well, that's kind of life, you know, the hard and the soft. You know, I mean, I like the idea of the opposites. You know, that's what we're made of, you know, what. So that's part of the whole thing, I think.
And then after a year of pandemic, how do you feel, or what do you want to make? And that kind of dovetails one of the questions that I had was, how has the pandemic changed what you're making?
Well, you know, we were lucky because our studio was separate from the main building. There's probably 30 or 40 artists over there, but we had our own water source and bathroom. So we were able to go over every day. And so my routine was not, luckily, was not really, that part of my routine was not shaped so much by the pandemic. I think what happened was I became like super industrious. Like I just wanted to see, I just wanted to work. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't, you know, I just went ahead. I was really loving painting the patterns of these avatars. And so, I mean, it was a year of ups and downs for all of us. I mean, sometimes everything seemed fine, and then other times it was just time to cry, you know. So, yeah, what was the second part of the question? I forget.
Has it changed how you're working or what you're working on? I mean, you mentioned the one piece that's influenced by kind of the loss, but are there other things that you're looking to create or that you've been inspired?
I have been talking to a lot of artists about this, and many of us feel really too close to it. I mean, I think we're witness to it. I think that's an artist's role, is to be a witness. But I think out of it for me has come maybe a slowdown in terms of extracurricular activities. I mean, I was so focused on work and I so enjoyed it, and I hope I can keep that up in some ways and not be distracted by all those things that we thought we had to do, you know, running to Target, running here, running there. We'll see. And as far as subject matter, I don't know. I just do it piece by piece. I don't think in terms of, you know, I haven't thought about how to mourn those people yet. So I don't know. We'll see. I'm trying to just let it come out.
And then is there a specific symbolism or meaning to your use of horns and thorns and some of those other elements in your work?
Well, I think sometimes the evil is very seductive. I like weaponry a lot. I like all the gizmos of it. I like some of the things the military has done. I think they're incredibly technologically advanced. But of course, there's an edge, a thorny side to all of that too. So I think it's just my way of saying life is not always what it appears. And, you know, there can be beauty in some of the harder parts too.
And then have you shown your sculptures separately in their own exhibit or in conjunction with your two-dimensional work?
You know, I've shown them in conjunction. That's so funny you asked, because I was thinking, oh, it would be really neat to just have a show of some of the three-dimensional things, because I'm also doing some artifacts around this origin story, some wings and things that you'll see on my website. But no, I have never done just three-dimensional work as an exhibit. That would be cool. It would be fun.
And then kind of hearkening back to some of the first pieces that you showed with the Guns R Us, you mentioned the young girls that you were working with to create some of those pieces. Were those your students, or how did you find the girls?
Well, there's parallel projects going on. No, the Guns R Us was totally my work. But I thought, instead of just going to the neighborhood and asking them questions about the shootings and things, I should give back a little. And I had worked in that neighborhood previously. And so I went back to a settlement house, which is like a community house. And they had an after-school program. And there were two different age groups. I did a quilt, one large quilt, with the younger kids, where they chose the subject matter, and it turned out it was about their environment, and it turned out it was about their fear in the neighborhood. And that was just an incredible quilt, and it's still hanging in their settlement house. Another quilt project that I did after school, and I had some volunteers help me with that, was called the Dream Quilt Project. And we brought in speakers and things to have the girls realize that there was more to life than just this neighborhood. And what were their aspirations when they were 20 or 25? We tried to get them to project ahead by talking about different occupations. And each girl then made a quilt about her dream of her future self. And they got to take them home, and we made money for the project by doing a beautiful raffle quilt as a group, and we sold it. And it was auctioned off for more money than Michael Jordan's basketball. And that was the talk of the neighborhood. So that really gave a lot of energy to the project.
And then you mentioned so many unconventional materials, or unconventional in terms of what we typically think of with fiber. Are those things that you, like the mannequins, that you grab when you can and as they strike you, and then hoping that you can use them for another project? Or are there ones that you're specifically on the look for when you're working on a certain project?
Yeah, well, my husband just mentioned the eyeballs. That wasn't pictured. I have one quilt that's so heavy with metal eyeballs. I just love hardware stores and junk stores, and I love trinkets. And so if I see something that just grabs me, I just buy like a gross. And I've given a lot of that away because we've had to downsize. But yeah, I have hordes of things that I want to use as funky material. I think it's a comment on consumerism as well, just using masses of things. I used, in one series of quilts, it was eyeballs, and then I used artificial ears, Halloween ears. I put hundreds of ears on one, and what was the third one? Lips. I had plastic lips that I drilled holes in and sewed all over the pieces. Yeah, they were very heavy to hang, actually.
I can imagine with all of that attached.
Well, I like them.
And then I guess a final question, because we are just about out of time then. what's next? What are your current influences? What are you working on right now? What do you see coming up in the future?
Well, I have about 20 pieces of this beautiful twin rocker paper, and I've accomplished about 7 or 9 pieces. So I don't know if I'll be able to wade myself through that paper with these last long narrow avatars. We'll see. But I do have in mind that this story, this origin story, will have different aspects to it. Photographs. I like to do a lot of embroidered maps, drawings. I see it as kind of a whole world.
And that's our time for today. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody. We're getting some really wonderful feedback in the comments. A lot of love for you and what you had to share in the comments. One actually said, with basically pointing out all the different boundaries that are in there in the world and in fiber art generally, and how you're doing kind of breaking that convention. So there's just some really wonderful love. So I encourage you to read the comments. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The museum will be doing its next virtual program the first Friday in April. Again, at noon Central Time, we'll be doing a virtual tour of our Remnants exhibition. But I'd like to thank you again, Kathy, for joining us today, for taking so much time and putting together this wonderful presentation and sharing with us your work and your inspirations.
Thanks to everybody for joining. Can you save the chat so I can see the comments? Oh, Nelson did. He's on it. Thanks, Melissa. Thank you, everybody.